Okay, good evening and welcome to Successful Employment Negotiations. I'm Robert SanGeorge. My normal job is that of being the career advisor to graduate students in the School of Public Affairs at AU, a job which I've been doing for nearly 10 years now. I've been with AU a total of about 13 years, however. We're going to cover a lot today. Let me invite you, when you have questions, to use the chat or the Q&A, either one. I have them both open, and I will see them. And if you ask a question about a slide and I've gone on to a new slide, don't worry about it. I'm happy to return to the previous slide and to answer your question. So with that, let's get going. What are we going to talk about? When you should start negotiating on salary with an employer, some relevant research, understanding a really important concept in salary setting by employers called the midpoint. More on that in a moment. Various tactics you can use in negotiating. How to lay out all your experience, not in a resume, but in a much shorter, to the point document that basically makes the case as to why you should make more money, okay? And what is a master's degree worth if you are a graduate student and are going to be getting a master's degree? What is actually negotiable when you're talking to an employer? And then how to accept when an employer actually offers you something and you're ready to accept. So first of all, let's talk about this. If you are someone who has had internship experience but not job experience, whether or not you are coming into your senior year or a graduate student, job candidates tend to feel powerless, especially people who don't have a significant amount of professional work experience at jobs that are relevant to the kind of job you are applying for. And therefore, a lot of recent graduates or upcoming graduates, when they get an offer, they feel panicked and they feel pressured to accept as soon as possible, whatever the employer has offered, because wow, you don't know when the next offer is going to come. And it's seldom do you get two offers at the same time. It happens. I've actually had the pleasure of advising some students who have had a couple different offers and how to play one employer off against another, but it doesn't happen very often. Okay. It is always important right from the get-go when the subject turns to compensation to market yourself as confident and decisive. Employers can kind of smell if you're panicked and feeling powerless. Okay. And so let's keep going. First of all, when is the right time to negotiate? Never start talking, even mentioning salary, until you have a clear verbal job offer. Why? Because that's the time at which you have maximum leverage over an employer. If you start asking about salary, first of all, in the first round of an interview, an employer is likely to be put off by that and somewhat annoyed, and it may well hamper you getting a job. It may well be a negative factor. So you don't want to do that. But even if you're into a third round of interviews and you say to yourself, wow, it's getting close. Maybe I should talk to them about salary now. The answer is no. Because you see, here's how it works from an employer's point of view. And I was a senior executive for about 25 years in my life, hired hundreds of people. And I'll tell you how it works. When the screening process has gone from, let's say, 100 candidates down to maybe a dozen whose resumes you're looking at pretty closely, and then maybe down to 4 or 5 people whom you're actually interviewing, and then a second round, maybe it's down to 2 or 3 people, and then finally the third round, which might well be just 1 candidate or maybe 2 candidates, and then you, the employer, have made a decision. At that point, you do not want to revisit and start that process again. You just don't want to do it because you've persuaded yourself, and oftentimes there is a committee of people involved in these decisions who don't want to have another meeting to discuss the merits of the second and third choice candidates as versus each other, as opposed to the person that everybody agreed, hopefully agreed, was the best candidate. So when you get that offer, that's when you've got the most leverage, because the employer doesn't want to go back and doesn't want to extend it. Now, a strategy that a lot of employers pursue, particularly with entry-level staff positions or a little bit above entry level, is that they'll try to slam dunk you, okay, into accepting a job offer. All we can give you is amount X, and I'm sorry, but that's all we can do because that's all our budget allows, and so that'll be it. And you can listen to that respectfully, and then you can say, well, I understand that, but, okay, and then you start making your case as to why you should make something more. And by the way, if an employer, let's say, oftentimes they'll call you up on the phone and they'll say, well, we just want to be sure that we're in the right salary range for you if we proceed with interviewing you. What was it you were thinking about in terms of salary? Try to use the word range, which at least leaves some flexibility. I'm seeking a salary in the $50,000 range, or I'm seeking a salary in the $40,000 range, depending upon your qualifications and what degree you have, and how much experience you have. Talk about range, because that at least leaves some, room for maneuver. If they push you into saying that, you're going to have to respond, unfortunately. But, do it and then move on. But also try to shift the discussion when they bring that up. Ask them what the salary band is for the position you seek. Now, most employers who are medium-sized to large, small employers maybe not, have salary bands for various levels of positions, okay? Now, those salary bands are usually not public. Sometimes if it's a unionized situation, the employer will have to disclose to the union, yeah, if this person's being hired at this band, they have to have a salary within $40,000 to $50,000, or $50,000 to $60,000, or whatever the band is, okay? And they stick within those bands, because if you were to be hired for position A, and position A's salary range is $40,000 to $50,000, but they decided to pay you $55,000, people would get to know that, hey, they just ignored their own salary band, and that would create a lot of turmoil and unrest and unhappiness within the organization among the people who were still stuck in that salary band, okay? So you want to ask what the salary band is, because that's really important in terms of your negotiation. And that leads me to this thing, this concept, the midpoint. The midpoint is kind of a sacred concept among HR people. I mean, I never worked in HR, but I know this from talking to a lot of HR people. I don't need to, I've just explained the salary band concept to you. The midpoint, of course, is the midpoint of the salary band. So if the range was $35,000 to $45,000, the midpoint is $40,000. An employer almost never will be willing to bring in an employee above the midpoint in a salary band. Their thinking, and the thinking of human resources professionals, is that if you bring someone into the upper part of the salary band, that leaves you, the employer, with very little room to give them additional salary increases before they hit the ceiling, okay? And they just can't get any more raises unless the salary band itself changes, which generally employers are reluctant to do, because that increases their costs, not just for you, but for a whole range of employees who are in that band, okay? And if I'm not being clear about this, if you don't understand me, ask a question, but I hope I'm being fairly clear. So that's why you're almost never hired above the midpoint. Now, you're only going to know whether you're at the midpoint if you know the salary band, okay? So try to focus the negotiations, if you can get them to enter into negotiation, around the midpoint. And what I would do is, without telling the employer that you understand the concept of the midpoint, do not mention that phrase at all. Ask for something a little bit above the midpoint, knowing that you probably are going to have to negotiate down, But then the employer will feel like, well, they got to win. Okay, you asked the salary band was $50,000 to $60,000, and you asked for a salary of $57,000 or $58,000, but you knew you'd probably have to negotiate down to about 54 because they wouldn't bring you in above the midpoint. But the idea is, in the best of all possible worlds, you would have the satisfaction of knowing that you got the most that they would be willing to pay, which would probably be just a little bit below that midpoint in the salary range. Okay. And now, what if an employer does not disclose the salary band? Well, there are ways in which you can get at this kind of information, although it tends to be more generic, not necessarily for a specific employer. If you're negotiating with a nonprofit organization, you can go to guidestar.org. You can go to glassdoor.com, salary.com, payscale.com. I tend to like Glassdoor the most. Their information tends to be the most comprehensive. And you can, type in something like research assistant, Washington, D.C., because remember, salaries will differ in different places. Cost of living is higher here. Salaries tend to be higher. Research assistant, Washington, D.C., and then usually you will be asked in Glassdoor to fill in certain other things like, how big the employer is and stuff like that. And Glassdoor will give you an estimate based upon what it knows as to what that position should pay, okay, on average. But understand that Glassdoor is giving you an average, meaning that half the people in that band are below that average, half the people are above that average. And so that it has limitations. It doesn't mean you should absolutely be paid the average, but you certainly should not be much below the average that, say, Glassdoor gives you. And another thing you can do is try to determine what equivalent alumni from your major are earning by looking at LinkedIn, and you see someone who is a policy analyst with 2 years experience, living in DC, working for a particular employer. And not that you have to ask them for their salary, you can probably find out what their salary range is from Glassdoor, okay? And then you can say to yourself, well, that person makes this amount of money. I wouldn't do it just for one person. I would try to do it for maybe 3 or 4 people, so you've got some kind of basis upon which to say, okay, I've done a bit of research here and I've got a critical amount of information. And that's another way of figuring out roughly how much you should be making. Take notes from this information. Print out the page on Glassdoor that shows this stuff. You can use this during a salary negotiation. The one thing I probably did not emphasize enough, when it gets to the point where you've been offered a job and maybe the employer is trying to slam dunk you into accepting a salary that may well be lower than what you thought, you want to slow it down. And one of the ways to do that is to say, well, can I have 48 hours to think about this? Generally speaking, they'll say yes. They're not going to withdraw the offer, okay? And that's where, you start doing your research. And actually, once you get into a second or particularly a third round interview for a job, you should be doing this research on salaries. Not to, start assuming, well, I've got this job locked, because you might not. I mean, a third round interview could involve 2 really strong candidates, you and someone else, and maybe you don't get the job. That happens. But you may want to have that information already in hand, because knowledge is power in a situation when you're negotiating salary. GuideStar.org, by the way, with regard to nonprofits, what you would want to do, GuideStar gives you access to the nonprofit tax returns of hundreds, if not a few thousand, nonprofit organizations in the United States. It's called an IRS 990 form, IRS 990. On that IRS 990 form, typically about 20 pages into it, so you got to quickly scroll down until you see a list of people. Nonprofits are required to disclose, I believe it is their top 5 paid employees. So You will know what, for example, the CEO was paid, not currently, but the last time a tax return was filed. And since IRS 990s, I think have to be filed in March or April, and then GuideStar takes time to get it all into their system. At this point, you'd probably be looking at a 2019 fiscal year IRS 990 form for a particular nonprofit. But you can start to make some judgments. And I'll give you an example. The Atlantic Council is a fairly prestigious think tank in town. But I will tell you, they don't pay well. And how do I know that? Because I went into GuideStar and I looked at what they pay their CEO and the next 4 highest staff, which were some senior staff people. And for a fairly large and prestigious think tank, it was pretty low. That led me to believe that, you know, coming in at entry level, a little bit above entry level, they're probably going to pay close to minimum, which in DC these days, for a medium-sized and larger employer would tend to be, for someone with a bachelor's degree, would tend to be around $40,000 a year and not much more than that. Master's degree maybe somewhat higher, a little bit of experience, maybe a little higher than that, but they're pretty cheap, okay? And I don't mean to single them out. I think it's a great place. A lot of people do interesting internships there, so I wouldn't warn you away from them. But they do pay low, and you can start to figure that out by looking at what they pay their senior executives, okay? So that's that stuff. And this is, yeah, I was hoping I had this. This is a screen capture from, you know, how much does a research assistant make in Washington, D.C.? So I specified an employer size, as you can see there, of 51 to 200 employees. So that's kind of medium sized, okay? And it's management consulting. We're talking probably about for-profit here, not nonprofit, where they're looking for 1 to 3 years experience. That 1 year experience could be 4 internships that you worked, okay? And, you know, you're likely to make, and by the way, this is a little bit old. This is a couple of years old when I did this. So probably you're at about $50,000 a year now to be a research assistant with a management consulting firm, medium-sized in DC. If you've got at least, you know, a few internships under your belt, and they're willing to hire you, obviously. And that's, you know, good information to have. You can, you know, depending on what the job is, generally speaking, jobs with the title associate pay better than jobs with the title assistant. Analyst jobs will pay about the same as associate jobs, or maybe a little more, it depends. Another way, by the way, of trying to gauge what an employer pays, particularly if they are a federal contractor, or if they do, even if they're only a partial federal contractor who also does other business, is to look at the federal salary levels. Okay, this is called the GS scale. And if you were to search Google for GS scale, Washington, D.C., you'll get a calculator that will show you, for example, what a GS7, which is generally speaking, someone with a bachelor's degree and a year or so of experience, or someone with a master's degree and no experience, would be paid in the federal government. And these days, that's around $40,000 or so, if I remember correctly. On the other hand, there's GS9, which someone with a master's degree and a bit of experience would come in at, and that tends to be, that's over $50,000. I think it's 55, 58,000, something like that. Understand that the federal government adjusts salaries upward, I forgot what percent, for the DC area because of the cost of living, okay? Versus what basic federal salaries are for other parts of the country. Now, federal contractors for equivalent jobs, right? If you're in a federal contractor, you're often doing a job that a federal employee would do, okay? So you can figure out that, hey, you know, I should be making roughly X. But here's the way the federal government works, by the way. Let's say you qualified for a GS9 position at $55,000, $58,000 a year, something like that. The federal government has what they call steps, and I believe there are 10 steps in each salary band. And technically, you move up one step. for each year of federal experience you get. Most of the time you'll be hired at GS9 or GS7 step 1, and usually they will not bend that. They will not be willing to bring you in as a step 4 or step 5 who would make $5,000 or $7,000 a year more. Okay, but at least you can begin to gauge, okay, this is what the federal government makes. They are an overwhelming influence on salaries in the DC job market, particularly for federal contractors, and go from there. Okay, so that's yet another way. I'm trying not to make this too complicated. I'm not saying you have to do all of this, but I'm just trying to give you various options as to how to figure out what it is you ought to be paid. Negotiating tactics. As I said previously, be ready to negotiate from the second interview onward. A lot of HR staff are actually trained to rush you into accepting their first and therefore their lowest offer. You got to slow down the process, as I mentioned, ask for a day or two to consider. And then, once you get into, if you get past a second interview and they indicate there's going to be another interview, then you want to have a one-pager in your back pocket. What is that one-pager? It talks about relevant experience, but it's not a resume. It's a very simple listing of a job or internship you had on the left side, and on the right side in a column, the number of months you worked at it. 3 months for this internship, 4 months for that internship, 1 year for this or that job. If you have a master's degree, there is an argument to be made, or if you're going to have a master's degree, there's an argument to be made that that's equivalent to 24 months of experience. Okay, the federal government used to automatically give you credit for 24 months of experience with a master's degree. They don't do that anymore, but you can still try to get away with it. Okay, so what you do is you list all these internships. Maybe you've had a job or two. You're further into your career. Do it all by months. Total up all the months at the bottom of the document and divide by 12, and there you've got, the number of years of relevant experience you have. And you want to be able to say to the employer, and maybe if you've been able to delay them by a day or two, which you should be able to do, you shoot them an email with this document and say, I'd like if we could discuss this document because I believe it backs up my request for an additional, X number of $1,000 in salary. So the idea is you're not just saying, I think I should make $3,000 more than or $5,000 more than you want to pay me. You're saying, I believe it is justified that I would be paid X amount of money more because I have this experience, and you've got it laid out. So you can see the strength of that. You're not just pulling stuff out of the air, all right? And again, you're trying to position yourself, actually, I say at the midpoint, you're trying to position yourself slightly above the midpoint with the understanding that they're almost certainly going to knock you down to be just under the midpoint, okay? So what is and is not, and by the way, if anybody has questions, nobody seems to be asking questions, but anyhow, what is and is not negotiable when it comes time to talk about it? So when they've made an offer? Salary is certainly negotiable. Your starting date is negotiable. Your daily office schedule, there's a limited amount of negotiability. Although these days in the post-pandemic era, it depends on how the employer is responding to, are they willing to let you work on a hybrid schedule? Do you want to work on a hybrid schedule? Maybe you want to come in the office every day. Maybe not. So maybe 2 days a week, maybe 3 days a week. That's negotiable. When you do come in, what are the hours you're going to work? Typically, it's going to have to be probably 8 to 4 or 9 to 5, something like that. Maybe 10 to 6. And Monday through Friday, unless you're working for some unusual employer who has people working on weekends or at nights or whatever. Will the employer provide you with a laptop or a phone? Particularly important if you're going to be working from home. What kind of training and what really you should be referring to as professional development are they willing to provide? And depending on how the negotiations are going, what are your future opportunities for promotion? You don't want to get too far ahead of the game, and you don't want to annoy them at this point. So that's 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 a very tentative maybe that I'm giving you as to whether you would want to say, well, what would be my opportunities? They're not going to give you any guarantees, obviously. Oh yes, in 18 months we'll promote you to this point, but you might want to know about that. What is not negotiable? Health insurance is not negotiable. They have to provide the same health insurance for everybody. Okay. The 401k plan, which in nonprofits is usually called a 403b, they operate almost identically. Whatever the employer's match is, I mean, for example, at American University, if the employee contributes 5% of their salary, their gross salary, into their 403b plan, because American University is a nonprofit institution, American will contribute 10% additionally into your 401k plan. It's actually a pretty generous plan. A lot of big universities do it that way because they need to do that in order to recruit top flight faculty. Generally, negotiation time is not negotiable, or excuse me, vacation time is not negotiable. I can tell you a story about a time it was for me, but I was well into my career. I was negotiating a senior vice president position at a think tank in DC. They had made the decision to hire me. And I was coming from Europe, where I had actually 6 weeks vacation a year because it was Europe. And that's what they do there. And they said, okay, it'll be 2 weeks vacation. And I just thought, what? I mean, I didn't say it, but I thought, are you kidding me? 2 weeks vacation? And they said, oh yeah, all new employees start at 2 weeks. And I just said, no, I don't. I'm mid-career. And I told them that I was used to 6 weeks vacation in Europe. I understand that's not a standard in the US, but I said, I have to start at 4 weeks. And they said, fine. They gave in very quickly on that. But when you're much earlier in your career, you have no leverage to be able to negotiate more vacation time. Sick leave is not negotiable. Whatever the sick leave is what you get for all employees. And there's other kinds of minor benefits involving disability insurance and stuff like that that are not negotiable. So understanding that stuff is important. Now, someone asked, if you have a clearance, meaning a security clearance, should that be part of salary negotiation? If you already have a clearance, I assume that's what you mean, that does make you worth more to them. However, you've got to be very clear as to what that clearance is, because there are clearances and then there are other clearances. There is not a unified system of clearances in the federal government, despite the fact that Congress and the Bush administration said that things were going to be very unified after 9/11. They really aren't. I'll give you an example. The CIA has its own security clearance process. The Justice Department has its own security clearance process. The FBI has its own process. A bunch of other federal agencies, State Department, Labor, Transportation, HHS, et cetera, to the extent that some of them do or do not have clearances, they have a unified clearance process. So there's a bunch of agencies which, aside from the State Department, are mainly focused on domestic policy, which have a unified clearance system. But there are major exceptions. As I say, federal law enforcement, intel, the intelligence community, they have their own systems. So you may have a clearance from, say, an internship you did at the State Department, but if you're getting a job at the Justice Department, it's a different system. And it will help that you have a clearance, but they still have to go through the whole process, okay? So understand that you're negotiating having that clearance already, and also that the clearance is active. You know, you may have left whatever job it was or internship it was that gave you that clearance, and typically the clearances are active for a while. Could be 1 year, could be longer. So make sure the clearance is still active. Also, make sure it's at the same level. You may have gotten a secret level clearance, which is the lowest level clearance you can get, and maybe they want to give you a top secret, which I know sounds really high. It's only the second lowest level of clearance. And then there's something called top secret, SCCI. I won't even begin to explain that stuff. And it goes on up from there. And until it gets to the point of, things that only the president and vice president can see and stuff like that. But you have to know, because if you're going to get a job that has a higher level clearance than you already have, you're going to have to go through that process. All right. So yes, in general, having a clearance is helpful when negotiating, but you have to understand the nuances of the situation really well. Okay. So this is what is and is not negotiable in salaries and other things. How to accept, when you're finally ready to accept, either because they've kind of shoved it down your throat, which can happen. I mean, unfortunately. One of the things I do at AU is I coach candidates for the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. And I've occasionally, when they ask for it, coached those people when they are about ready to accept one of the PMF positions, which are full-time federal jobs with full benefits. And oftentimes, certain agencies will say, it's GS9, step one, take it or leave it. And they say that because they know there are 5 people behind you who are ready to jump in and take that job. And so that's the only choice you have. And a lot of times there's just no negotiating. It depends on how hard-nosed the employer, whether it's a federal agency or a federal contractor or a nonprofit or a for-profit consulting firm or whatever. It depends on how hard-nosed they want to be. You can only make your best case and then see where you're at. And then if they have, kind of shoved it down your throat, then you say to yourself, okay, am I still going to take this job? And that's highly hypothetical. So I'm not saying even if they've shoved it down your throat that you should turn down the job. But you want to think about, what that means. Okay. So show enthusiasm immediately about, I'm really excited about getting to work, blah, blah, blah. Start asking them about reading and preparation you can do before your first day. You want to get off on the right foot and make them really enthusiastic and essentially confirm to them, boy, we've made the right decision. This person is really enthusiastic about the job. Now there's another, no, there is not another question actually. That's it in terms of salary negotiations. This is not a hugely long presentation. It's, salary negotiating is not brain surgery. It involves certain nuances and certain fortitude on your part not to be, as I say, panicked and feeling panicked and powerless. But that's basically it. Anybody got any other questions? By the way, in the chat box, I've typed my email, robert.sangeorge@american.edu. If you wanted to ask a question and maybe you didn't want to ask it in front of everybody else, I'd be happy to have you ask me that question. I will tell you that I only do advising in the School of Public Affairs. So if you're not an SBA student, you have to look to whomever your career advisor is in whatever AU school you are going to. So with that, I think I'm going to close down and hope this was helpful. Good luck in your salary negotiation. And it's a pretty good job market out there, particularly in the DC area. So you should be getting jobs when you graduate. So good night and good luck.